Did medieval kings and queens really throw parties so extravagant they drained entire treasuries? Were royal families truly brought to their knees by the cost of saying "I do" in the period stretching from the 11th to the late 15th century? Prepare to discover how these lavish spectacles of power and pomp pushed royal finances past their breaking point. Number 9. King Henry III of England and Eleanor of Provence. The year was 1236, and the stage was set for a wedding of monumental scale in Canterbury. King Henry III, eager to solidify his rule and secure alliances, sought a bride from the prestigious House of Provence. His choice fell upon Eleanor, the second daughter of Raymond Berengar IV, Count of Provence. This union was not just about love. Though contemporary accounts speak of a genuine affection, it was a political maneuver designed to bring wealth, influence, and connections to the English crown. However, the cost of bringing Eleanor to England and celebrating their marriage would plunge the king into a financial abyss that would plague his reign for decades. Eleanor's journey from Provence was a procession fit for a queen, even before she became one. Her retinue, composed of her maternal uncle, Boniface of Savoy, and a host of Provençal nobles and ladies, traversed France, requiring enormous provisions and lodging along the way. Every stop, every night's stay, incurred significant expense, paid for by the English treasury. This was not a quick trip. It was a slow, majestic advance, intended to impress but also to consume resources. Cost of transporting her dowry, which included a relatively modest sum of 20,000 marks, but also numerous precious silks, jewels, and furs, added to the already spiraling expenditure. The dowry itself, while valuable, was overshadowed by the sheer operational costs of the wedding celebrations. The wedding ceremony itself, held at Canterbury Cathedral on January 14, 1236, was a spectacle of unparalleled luxury. The guest list was immense, numbering in the thousands, encompassing English and Provençal nobility, bishops, abbots, and knights. Each guest, from the most powerful earl to the lowliest squire, expected to be fed, entertained, and housed lavishly. The cathedral itself was adorned with rich tapestries, imported from Flanders and France, depicting heroic deeds and biblical scenes. These tapestries alone represented a significant investment, often rented or purchased at exorbitant rates. The altar was dressed with new jewel-encrusted cloths, and the clergy wore newly tailored vestments of the finest brocade. The feasting that followed the ceremony was legendary. Chroniclers from the time, such as Matthew Paris, detailed the incredible array of food served. Hundreds of oxen, thousands of chickens, and countless fish were prepared. Exotic spices, imported from the East at great cost, flavored every dish. Wine flowed freely from countless casks brought from Bordeaux and Burgundy. The kitchen staff, augmented for the event, worked tirelessly to produce multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Sugar, a luxury item, was used in abundance for elaborate sculpted sweets and desserts, proving the royal family's immense wealth. Cost of sourcing, transporting, and preparing this food alone was a king's ransom, depleting the royal larder and requiring substantial purchases from merchants and purveyors across the kingdom. Entertainment was a continuous affair throughout the wedding festivities, which lasted for several days. Minstrels, troubadours, and jesters performed endlessly. Acrobats and jugglers delighted the crowds. More importantly, knights engaged in grand tournaments and jousts, requiring the construction of temporary grandstands and lists and the provision of new armor, lances, and horses. These tournaments were not just games, they were displays of martial prowess and wealth, where prizes of immense value were distributed. The sheer number of participants and spectators meant that the logistical and financial burden was immense. cost of feeding and housing the tournament participants and their entourages, sometimes for weeks, added significantly to the total. The bride and groom's attire was a testament to the era's opulence. Eleanor's wedding gown was said to be woven from silk and gold thread, adorned with pearls and precious stones. Her crown, specially crafted for the occasion, sparkled with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. Henry's robes were equally magnificent, made of the finest crimson velvet, embroidered with gold. The entire royal court, from the highest-ranking nobles to the personal servants, received new outfits for the occasion. Made from expensive fabrics like velvet, silk, and brocade, often lined with ermine or sable fur. Cost of these garments alone, requiring master tailors and a vast supply of luxury materials, was staggering. The gifts exchanged were another major drain on the treasury. Henry gave Eleanor magnificent jewels, including a massive sapphire, a gift that later chroniclers noted as a significant expenditure. Guests in turn presented gifts to the royal couple, but the crown also had to give gifts to its most important allies and dignitaries present, often in the form of precious metals, jewels, or fine horses. King also provided lodging and upkeep for a significant number of Eleanor's Provençal retinue for months after the wedding, further extending the financial strain. The immediate financial consequence of this lavish wedding was a massive increase in the crown's debt. King Henry III was already known for his poor financial management and his extravagant spending habits. The wedding of 1236 exacerbated this tenfold. To finance the event, Henry borrowed heavily from Italian banking houses, particularly the Riccardi of Lucca, and from Jewish moneylenders in England. These loans came with high interest rates, creating a cycle of debt that became increasingly difficult to escape. The royal jewels were frequently pawned to secure these loans, only to be redeemed at great cost later. Furthermore, to raise funds, Henry resorted to levying new unpopular taxes on his subjects, including an aid for the marriage of his daughter, even though he had only just been married. These taxes, along with his general mismanagement and preference for foreign advisors, bred deep resentment among the English barons and the common people. This financial distress, directly aggravated by the wedding's expense, was a major contributing factor to the political tensions that eventually culminated in the Second Barons' War in the 1260s. The wedding, intended to bring stability and prestige, instead sowed the seeds of financial ruin and civil unrest, leaving the English crown in a state of perpetual impecuniosity for much of Henry's long reign. Number 8. King Edward I of England and Eleanor of Castile. The year was 1254, and the marriage of Prince Edward, son of King Henry III, to Eleanor of Castile, half-sister of King Alfonso X of Castile, was a union of immense political importance. It was designed to resolve a long-standing territorial dispute over Gascony, a valuable English possession in France, and to forge a powerful alliance between England and the burgeoning Kingdom of Castile. Though Edward was still a prince, the wedding was celebrated with a pomp and scale befitting a future king, and its costs, falling primarily on his already financially struggling father, contributed significantly to the financial woes of the English monarchy. The arrangements began with Edward's journey to Spain, a grand expedition in itself. He traveled with a substantial retinue of English nobles and knights, all of whom had to be provisioned and accommodated throughout the long journey across France and into the Iberian Peninsula. The travel alone, taking several weeks, incurred massive costs for lodging, food, and security. Diplomatic gifts were exchanged with various lords and potentates along the route, further adding to the expenses. This was not merely a trip. It was a diplomatic parade, designed to showcase English wealth and power, even if that power was largely borrowed. The wedding took place in the monastery of Las Huelgas, near Burgos, Castile, in October 1254. While the primary expenses for the Spanish side were covered by Alfonso X, Henry III was still responsible for the costs associated with his son's retinue, their accommodation, and the gifts Edward would present. Edward, known even as a young man for his personal grandiosity, spared no expense in demonstrating his future monarchical status. The ceremony was a grand affair, attended by the Castilian court and the English contingent. The monastery was richly decorated, and the solemn vows were exchanged amidst a dazzling display of wealth. The feasting that followed was a true Castilian spectacle, but it was also a burden on the English coffers for their part of the hospitality. Hundreds of dishes were served, reflecting the rich culinary traditions of both England and Spain. Exotic fruits, spices, and wines, brought from across the Mediterranean, graced the tables. The English contingent contributed to the cost of these provisions, ensuring that their guests were fed to the highest standard. The amount of meat, bread, and ale consumed by thousands of guests over several days was staggering, requiring a vast network of suppliers and a huge expenditure of coin. Entertainment was a crucial element of the celebrations. Tournaments and jousts were held, prodding the chivalric prowess of both English and Castilian knights. These events required elaborate preparations, including the construction of temporary arenas and stands. The cost of new armor, weapons, and horses for the participants, along with the valuable prizes awarded, added significantly to the overall bill. Musicians, dancers, and storytellers from both cultures entertained the guests, their performances adding to the festive atmosphere, but their employment also came at a considerable cost. Castilian court itself, a center of learning and culture, would have ensured that the entertainment was of the highest standard, and Edward's contribution to this was not small. Eleanor's trousseau was a significant part of the financial outlay for the Castilian court, but Edward's gifts to her, and the provision of her household once she was in England, became an English expense. She brought with her an impressive collection of jewels, fine silks, and gold and silver plate, all part of her dowry from King Alfonso. However, Edward, in his turn, presented her with magnificent gifts, including a lavish collection of English jewels and furs. Her personal wardrobe, once she joined Edward, was extensive, filled with gowns of rich fabrics like brocade velvet and cloth of gold, all lined with ermine or sable, demonstrating her elevated status as a future queen. The immediate financial impact of this wedding fell primarily on King Henry III. He was already deeply in debt, struggling with the costs of his own lavish lifestyle and his ambitious, often unsuccessful, foreign policies. The expenses of his son's journey to Spain, the wedding celebrations, and the establishment of Edward and Eleanor's joint household upon their return to England further exacerbated the crown's precarious financial situation. Henry had to secure more loans from Italian bankers, particularly the Recordati of Lucca, pushing the crown deeper into the red. The financial strain was so severe that it contributed to the growing discontent among the English barons, who were increasingly frustrated by Henry's extravagant spending and his reliance on foreign advisors and creditors. King's constant requests for money, often for grand projects and foreign adventures that yielded little benefit, fueled the unrest. The marriage of Edward and Eleanor, while strategically important, was another example of royal expenditure that seemed boundless, despite the widespread poverty among the populace. Upon their return to England, Edward and Eleanor continued to maintain a lavish household, living beyond their immediate means. Edward, even as a prince, incurred significant debts, which his father often had to cover. Cost of their separate court, their travels, and their own diplomatic engagements continued to be a drain on the royal coffers. The need to finance these ongoing expenses led to further borrowing and increased taxation, creating a vicious cycle of financial strain for the English monarchy. While the marriage secured Gascony for England and established a powerful alliance, its immediate financial cost was immense. It added a substantial burden to an already overstretched royal treasury, pushing Henry III further towards insolvency. constant struggle for funds would remain a defining feature of Henry's later reign, eventually contributing to the political instability and civil unrest that would erupt into the Second Barons' War. The wedding, therefore, was not merely a joyous occasion, but a catalyst that deepened the financial crisis of the English crown, setting the stage for future conflicts born from economic distress. Number 7. Isabella of France and Edward II of England. The year was 1308, and the setting was Boulogne-sur-Mer in France. The union of Isabella, the young daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France and King Edward II of England, was hailed as a symbol of peace and alliance between the two rival kingdoms. However, behind the facade of glittering pomp and diplomatic success lay a financial reality that would strain the English treasury to its breaking point, contributing to the instability and eventual downfall of Edward II's reign. This wedding was not just expensive, it was a defiant display of wealth that belied the king's actual financial capabilities. Edward II arrived in France with a massive retinue, numbering over 1,000 people, including many of England's most prominent nobles. Each person in this entourage required sustenance, lodging, and transport, all at the English crown's expense. King's personal baggage train was enormous, carrying not only his clothes and jewels, but also rich gifts for the French court. The journey from London to Boulogne, itself a significant undertaking, required meticulous planning and vast expenditures on provisions, accommodation, and security. Chroniclers noted the sheer scale of the English delegation, marveling at their lavish apparel and abundant resources, all paid for with coin that the English treasury barely possessed. The wedding ceremony, held on January 25, 1308, in the Church of Notre Dame in Boulogne, was a truly grand affair. Both the French and English courts were present, adorned in their finest attire. Isabella, known as the She-Wolf of France in later years, was dressed in a gown of shimmering silk and gold brocade adorned with jewels. Edward, equally resplendent, wore robes of velvet and ermine. Church was decorated with rich tapestries and banners, and the air was filled with the scent of incense and the sound of solemn music. The vows were exchanged before an assembly of the most powerful people in Europe, and the display of wealth and power was meant to cement the Anglo-French alliance. The feasting that followed was legendary in its extravagance. Counts described tables groaning under the weight of hundreds of courses. Exotic meats like swan, peacock, and boar were served alongside more common fare, all prepared with rare and expensive spices. Rivers of wine and ale flowed, sourced from the finest vineyards of France and England. Sugar, a luxury item, was used to create elaborate culinary sculptures and desserts. The number of guests meant that vast quantities of food and drink were consumed over several days of continuous revelry. Cost of provisioning such a feast, involving countless purveyors and cooks, put an immense strain on the English crown's already meager funds. Entertainment was ceaseless. Designed to impress the French court and entertain the multitude of guests, minstrels, acrobats, and jesters performed continuously. There were elaborate masks and dances. Knights engaged in grand tournaments and jousts, which were immensely popular but incredibly expensive. These events required the construction of temporary grandstands, the provision of horses, armor, and weapons, and the awarding of valuable prizes. The spectacle of these chivalric contests, while thrilling, was a massive financial drain, consuming funds that the English treasury desperately needed for more pressing matters. Isabella's dowry was significant, totaling 18,000 pounds, but it was largely in land and rights, not immediately liquid cash, which meant it did not offset the immediate wedding costs. Her trousseau, however, was immense, including numerous gowns of silk and velvet, jewels, and household goods. Edward, in turn, showered her with lavish gifts, including a gold crown set with precious stones and other expensive jewels. The establishment of her own household in England upon their return became another major ongoing expense for the English crown. She brought with her a large retinue of French attendants, all of whom required wages and upkeep. The financial consequences for Edward II were immediate and severe. He had already inherited a substantial debt from his father, Edward I, due to prolonged wars. This wedding, far from improving his financial standing, plunged him deeper into insolvency. To finance the wedding, Edward borrowed heavily from Italian banking houses like the Frescobaldi and from wealthy English merchants. These loans came with high interest rates, creating a cycle of debt that became increasingly difficult to manage. The royal jewels were frequently pawned to secure these loans, only to be redeemed at great cost. The extravagance of the wedding also highlighted Edward II's perceived profligacy and his favoritism towards figures like Piers Gaveston, his controversial companion. Gaveston was given a prominent role at the wedding, receiving magnificent gifts and honors, further angering the English nobility who viewed him with suspicion and contempt. This perceived misspending, coupled with the rising debt, fueled animosity among the powerful barons. They saw the king squandering resources on lavish displays while neglecting the true needs of the kingdom and its people. The debt incurred from this wedding, combined with ongoing military expenditures and Edward's poor financial management, led to continuous financial crises throughout his reign. He was constantly struggling for funds, resorting to unpopular taxes and forced loans, which alienated his subjects and exacerbated political tensions. Perceived wastefulness of the wedding became a symbol of Edward's fiscal irresponsibility in the eyes of his critics. This financial distress contributed significantly to the political unrest and the growing opposition to his rule, eventually culminating in his deposition and brutal murder in 1327. The wedding intended to usher in an era of peace and prosperity, instead became a precursor to financial ruin and political chaos for the English monarchy. Number 6. Philippa of England and Eric of Pomerania. The year was 1406, and the stage for one of the most magnificent royal weddings of the late medieval period was set in Lund, then part of Denmark. The bride was Philippa, the youngest daughter of King Henry IV of England, and the groom was Eric of Pomerania, the King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, uniting the Kalmar Union. This marriage was a major political coup for both sides, intended to solidify alliances and strengthen monarchical power in Northern Europe. However, the sheer scale of the celebration, particularly from the English perspective, would impose a colossal financial burden that Henry IV's already struggling treasury could ill afford. The journey for Philippa and her English retinue was an epic undertaking. A fleet of English ships, including the largest vessel of the English Navy, the Gracedieu, was commissioned for the voyage. Costs associated with outfitting these ships, provisioning them for a long sea journey, and paying their crews ran into thousands of pounds. Philippa's entourage included numerous English nobles, knights, ladies-in-waiting, and a vast array of servants, all requiring passage, food, and accommodation. The procession from London to Lynn, where they boarded the ships, was a grand parade, involving elaborate escorts and numerous stops, each incurring significant expenditure. This journey alone was a display of English might and wealth, an expensive prelude to the main event. The wedding took place in Lund Cathedral on October 26, 1406. Eric of Pomerania, as the host, bore the brunt of the immediate reception costs, but the English contingent, eager to showcase their nation's prestige, contributed substantially to the magnificence. The cathedral was transformed into a lavish spectacle, adorned with rich tapestries, banners bearing the coats of arms of both royal houses, and countless candles. Philippa's wedding gown was described as exceptionally beautiful, made of the finest silks and velvets, adorned with pearls and precious stones, a true masterpiece of English craftsmanship costing a small fortune. The feasting that followed was a monumental event, lasting for several days. Guests from across northern Europe, including many powerful German and Scandinavian nobles, were entertained. Tables groaned under the weight of countless dishes. Roasted meats, game, fowl, and fish, all prepared with the most expensive spices imported from distant lands. Wine flowed freely, brought from the Rhineland in France. Sugar, a symbol of extreme luxury, was used abundantly for elaborate desserts and intricate sweet sculptures. The sheer volume of provisions required and the cost of the skilled cooks and servers represented a colossal expense for the royal coffers. Entertainment was a continuous and elaborate affair. There were jousts and tournaments, showing the martial prowess of knights from various kingdoms. These events required significant investment in temporary structures, new armor, weapons, and horses, as well as valuable prizes for the victors. Musicians, minstrels, and jesters from both England and the Kalmar Union performed tirelessly, adding to the festive atmosphere, but their employment also came at a substantial cost. The celebrations were not just parties. They were carefully orchestrated diplomatic events designed to cement alliances and impress the assembled potentates, even if the cost pushed the hosts to their financial limits. Philippa's dowry was set at 20,000 nobles, a significant sum for the time, though often these dowries were paid in installments or in kind rather than immediate cash. Her trousseau, however, was an immense financial undertaking for the English crown. It included not only an extensive wardrobe of luxurious gowns and furs, but also a vast collection of jewels, gold and silver plate, tapestries, and other household goods necessary to establish her new royal household in Denmark. These items represented an enormous investment in raw materials, skilled labor, and transport. Edward of Norwich, who escorted Philippa, was granted a massive sum by Henry IV to cover the expenses of the journey and the gifts. The financial consequences for King Henry IV were severe. Henry had seized the throne from Richard II just 7 years prior, and his reign was plagued by financial instability. He had inherited a massive debt from the previous king, and he was constantly battling rebellions and threats to his authority, both at home and abroad. Cost of Philippa's wedding, including the vast expenses of her journey, her trousseau, and the accompanying diplomatic gifts, was a crippling blow to an already precarious treasury. To finance these expenditures, Henry IV was forced to resort to desperate measures. He borrowed heavily from English merchants and foreign bankers, often at usurious rates. The royal jewels, a crucial part of the crown's portable wealth, were frequently pawned to secure loans, a common but desperate practice among medieval monarchs. Parliament, already reluctant to grant him funds due to his perceived extravagance and his tenuous claim to the throne, grew even more resistant. They questioned the necessity of such lavish spending when the kingdom was struggling with debt and unrest. The financial strain from this wedding, combined with ongoing military campaigns and the general costs of maintaining his insecure grip on the throne, left Henry IV perpetually short of funds. He was known for his poverty despite being king, a direct consequence of his inability to control royal spending and the heavy debts incurred from events like Philippa's wedding. This financial distress spread resentment among his subjects and contributed to the instability that marked his reign. The wedding, meant to project strength and secure alliances, instead deepened the financial hole for the English crown, serving as a stark reminder of the immense cost of maintaining royal prestige in the medieval world. Number 5. Joanna of Navarre and King Henry IV of England. The year was 1403, and the setting was Winchester Cathedral in England. The bride was Joanna of Navarre, the widow of Duke John IV of Brittany, and the groom was King Henry IV of England, a monarch still struggling to consolidate his grasp on the throne after deposing Richard II. This marriage was primarily a political one, intended to secure Brittany's neutrality, or even alliance, in the ongoing 100 Years' War with France, and to provide Henry with a queen who had grown children, ensuring stability. However, even for a king perpetually in debt, the wedding was celebrated with a level of pomp that further exacerbated the English crown's financial woes. Joanna's journey to England was a grand procession befitting a queen. She arrived with a significant retinue of Breton and French nobles and servants. Henry IV, determined to impress his new queen and her entourage, dispatched a fleet of ships to bring her from Brittany to England. The cost of outfitting these vessels, provisioning them and paying the crews, along with the expense of the overland journey from the coast to Winchester, represented a considerable drain on the royal coffers. Every step of her progress was marked by displays of hospitality and military escort, adding to the total expense. The wedding ceremony, held on February 7, 1403, at Winchester Cathedral, was a solemn but magnificent affair. The cathedral was decorated with rich hangings and banners, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. Joanna, despite being a widow, was dressed in opulent gowns, likely of silk and velvet adorned with jewels that symbolized her new status as Queen of England. Henry IV, ever conscious of presenting an image of legitimacy and power, also wore robes of the finest materials. The presence of numerous English nobles and clergy, all in their finest attire, added to the visual splendor. The feasting that followed the ceremony was a grand undertaking, designed to feed and entertain thousands of guests over several days. Royal accounts from the period reveal the scale of such events. Hundreds of roasted oxen, sheep, and pigs, along with vast quantities of fowl and fish, were consumed. Spices, imported from afar at great cost, were used liberally in the preparation of multiple courses. Wine flowed freely from countless barrels, and ale was served without stint. The expense of provisioning such a feast, especially for a king with a perpetually empty treasury, was immense. Purveyors were paid, sometimes belatedly, for the vast quantities of foodstuffs. Entertainment was provided to match the lavishness of the feast. Minstrels and musicians performed, and jesters provided comic relief. While perhaps not as elaborate as a full-blown tournament due to the king's financial constraints and ongoing rebellions, there would have been displays of skill and various forms of amusement suitable for a royal wedding. The aim was to impress and entertain, reflecting the dignity of the English crown, even as the funds for such activities were scarce. Joanna's dowry was an important part of the marriage agreement, but it was primarily composed of lands and revenues from Brittany, not liquid funds that could immediately offset the wedding costs for Henry. However, her trousseau and the gifts exchanged were still significant. Joanna brought with her many valuable personal items, and Henry, in turn, presented her with costly jewels and a new crown to signify her queenship. The establishment of her royal household, with its numerous officers and servants, also added a permanent expense to the English crown's budget. The immediate financial consequences for King Henry IV were profound. His reign, from its very beginning, was characterized by financial hardship. He had inherited a crown deeply in debt from the lavish spending and costly wars of Richard II. Furthermore, his seizure of the throne meant he constantly faced rebellions and challenges to his authority, requiring expensive military campaigns to suppress them. The wedding to Joanna of Navarre, while politically expedient, added yet another layer of debt to an already overburdened treasury. Henry IV was notoriously dependent on Parliament for grants of taxation. His frequent requests for money for military campaigns, and now for his royal wedding, were often met with resistance. Parliamentarians were wary of royal extravagance and demanded accountability for spending. To fund the wedding and other royal needs, Henry resorted to extensive borrowing from London merchants and foreign bankers. The royal jewels, and even gold and silver plate from the royal household, were frequently pawned to secure these loans, a clear sign of severe financial distress. The financial strain became a constant source of friction between Henry and his parliament, and it limited his ability to govern effectively. The cost of the wedding coming at a time of deep royal debt and ongoing political instability, was seen by some as an irresponsible indulgence. Chroniclers and parliamentary records reflect the crown's ongoing struggle for funds, often blaming it on Henry's inability to live within his means. This financial hardship, exacerbated by events like his own grand wedding, contributed to the deep-seated problems of his reign, ultimately leaving a legacy of chronic royal debt for his successor. The wedding, therefore, was not a singular event of bankruptcy, but a significant expense that contributed to an already precarious financial situation, pushing a struggling king further into an inescapable financial hole. Number 4. Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia. The year was 1382, and the setting was Westminster Abbey in London. The marriage of the young King Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia, daughter of Emperor Charles IV and sister of King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, was a union born of political necessity. England, still recovering from the Black Death and reeling from the costly Hundred Years' War, sought an alliance to bolster its position against France and to gain papal support. The wedding, however, was celebrated with a level of unparalleled extravagance that would later be seen as a symbol of Richard II's profligacy, contributing significantly to the financial strains that would plague his reign and ultimately lead to his downfall. Anne's journey to England was fraught with danger, sailing through French-controlled waters, but her arrival in England was met with immense pomp. Her retinue, which included numerous Bohemian nobles and ladies, required significant provisions and lodging from the moment they stepped ashore. Richard II, eager to impress his young bride and the European dignitaries accompanying her, spared no expense in her reception. Procession from Dover to London was a continuous spectacle, with crowds lining the roads and elaborate welcoming ceremonies at every major town, each requiring financial outlay for entertainment and gifts. The wedding ceremony itself, held on January 22, 1382, at Westminster Abbey, was a dazzling display of royal splendor. The abbey was elaborately decorated with rich hangings, tapestries, and banners. Anne's wedding gown was described as exceptionally beautiful, made of the finest silks and velvets adorned with countless pearls and precious stones. Richard, equally magnificent in robes of cloth of gold and ermine, was determined to outshine any previous English monarch. The entire court, from the highest-ranking nobles to the personal servants, was adorned in new, expensive attire, reflecting the king's lavish taste and the significant cost incurred for their provision. The feasting that followed was legendary in its scale and opulence. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart provide vivid accounts of the banquets that lasted for several days. Hundreds of oxen, sheep, and deer were roasted whole. Exotic fowl, such as peacocks, swans, and cranes, were served, often redressed in their feathers. Rare and expensive spices imported from the East flavored every dish. Wine flowed in seemingly endless quantities, brought from Gascony and Burgundy. Sugar, precious commodity, was molded into intricate subtleties. Edible sculptures depicting knights, castles, or allegorical figures which were immensely costly to produce. The sheer volume of food and drink consumed by thousands of guests represented a colossal expenditure, requiring vast sums to be paid to purveyors across the kingdom. Entertainment was constant and incredibly elaborate. Jousts and tournaments were held over several days, drawing crowds from across England. These events were not merely sporting contests, they were highly theatrical spectacles requiring the construction of temporary grandstands, lavishly decorated lists, and the provision of new armor, lances, and horses. Prizes of immense value, such as jeweled swords and richly caparisoned horses, were awarded to the victors. Minstrels, acrobats, and jesters performed continuously. There were elaborate masks, dances, and even theatrical performances, all designed to entertain and impress, and all costing a significant amount of money to stage. Anne's dowry was set at 20,000 marks, a substantial sum, but it was largely offset by a loan of the same amount that Richard provided to her brother Wenceslas. This meant that the actual financial benefit to England was minimal, effectively a wash or even a loss when considering the interest on the loan. Anne's trousseau, however, was magnificent, filled with exquisite gowns, furs, and a vast collection of jewels. Richard, in turn, presented her with immensely valuable gifts, including a new crown specially crafted for her and other precious gems. The establishment and maintenance of Anne's household as queen, with her numerous officers and servants, also became a significant, ongoing expense for the English crown. The immediate financial consequences for Richard II were severe. He had inherited a kingdom already burdened by the immense debts of the 100 Years' War. His personal extravagance and his preference for lavish displays, exemplified by his wedding, rapidly depleted the royal treasury. To finance this wedding and his subsequent lavish lifestyle, Richard began to levy unpopular taxes, such as the poll tax, which had already sparked the peasants' revolt in 1381. He also resorted to extensive borrowing from wealthy London merchants and Italian bankers, such as the Bardis and Peruzes, pushing the crown deeper into debt. The cost of this wedding and Richard's continued extravagant spending on his court was a constant source of friction between the king and his parliament. Parliamentarians repeatedly criticized his financial mismanagement and his perceived wastefulness, often refusing to grant him the funds he requested. The king's reliance on forced loans and benevolence's effectively compulsory donations further alienated his subjects and the powerful nobility. This financial distress contributed significantly to the political instability of Richard's reign. The image of a king squandering vast sums on personal luxury while the kingdom struggled with debt and poverty bred deep resentment among his subjects and the powerful noble factions. The wedding of Richard and Anne, a brilliant spectacle at the time, later became a symbol of the very excesses that alienated his people and eventually led to his deposition in 1399. It was not a singular event that caused bankruptcy, but a massive expense that pushed an already fragile royal treasury into an inescapable cycle of debt, ultimately contributing to the king's tragic end. Number 3. King Edward III of England and Philippa of Hainault. The year was 1328, and the setting was York Minster in England. The marriage of the young King Edward III, who had only recently ascended the throne after the deposition of his father, to Philippa of Hainault, daughter of Count William I of Hainault and Holland, was a crucial political alliance. It was intended to stabilize the new regime, secure a powerful continental ally against France, and validate Edward's claim to the throne. However, the wedding was celebrated with a magnificence that set a new standard for royal expenditure in England, quickly draining the royal coffers and initiating a pattern of debt that would define much of Edward's long and ambitious reign. Philippa's journey from Hainault to England was a grand procession, meticulously orchestrated to impress. She traveled with a substantial retinue of Hainault nobles and ladies, and Edward's regents, eager to secure the alliance, spared no expense in her reception. Costs associated with her travel, including provisions, lodging, and the ceremonial escorts across England to York, were immense. Gifts were exchanged at every stop, further adding to the mounting bill. This journey alone was a public demonstration of the wealth and prestige of the English crown, even as that wealth was being rapidly depleted. The wedding ceremony itself, held on January 24, 1328, at York Minster, was a lavish affair. The minster was adorned with rich tapestries, banners, and decorations specially commissioned for the event. Philippa, only 14 years old, was dressed in a gown of shimmering silk and gold thread, adorned with precious jewels. Edward, still a teenager, wore magnificent robes of velvet and ermine. The entire English court and the Hainault delegation were dressed in new, expensive attire, reflecting the enormous cost of luxury fabrics and skilled tailoring. The solemn vows were exchanged before an assembly of the most powerful nobles and clergy from both England and Hainault, signifying the importance of the union. The feasting that followed was a monumental undertaking, designed to feed and entertain thousands of guests for several days. Chroniclers of the time noted the astonishing array of food served: hundreds of roasted oxen, deer, and sheep, countless chickens, ducks, and geese. Exotic meats, such as swans and peacocks, were prepared and often redressed in their feathers, a costly but impressive culinary display. Vast quantities of rare and expensive spices, imported from the East, were used to flavor the multiple courses. Wine flowed freely from countless barrels, and ale was served without stint. The sheer scale of the provisions and the army of cooks and servers required represented an astronomical expense for the royal treasury. Entertainment was continuous and extravagant. Jousts and tournaments were held, trotting the martial prowess of English and Hainault knights. These events required significant investment in temporary grandstands, richly decorated lists, and the provision of new armor, weapons, and horses. Valuable prizes, including jeweled swords and richly caparisoned horses, were awarded to the victors. Minstrels, troubadours, acrobats, and jesters provided constant entertainment, their performances adding to the festive atmosphere, but their employment and elaborate staging came at a significant cost. The entire celebration was a carefully choreographed display of wealth and power, intended to solidify Edward's legitimacy and impress his new allies. Philippa's dowry was set at £20,000, a substantial sum. But like many dowries, it was often paid in installments or partially in kind, not as a single liquid cash infusion that could offset the immediate wedding costs. However, Philippa's trousseau was a significant expense for Hainault, and Edward in turn presented her with a vast array of expensive gifts, including the new crown and numerous precious jewels. The establishment of her royal household, with its many officers and servants, also became a permanent and substantial ongoing expense for the English crown. The immediate financial consequences for Edward III and the English crown were severe. Edward had inherited a kingdom already burdened by the debts of his father, Edward II's disastrous reign. The magnificent wedding, intended to project an image of power and stability, instead plunged the young king deeper into financial distress. To finance the wedding and his subsequent aggressive foreign policy, including the renewed 100 Years' War, Edward III resorted to unprecedented levels of borrowing. He relied heavily on loans from Italian banking houses, particularly the Bardi and Peruzzi families, and from wealthy English merchants. These loans often came with high interest rates, creating a cycle of debt that became increasingly difficult to escape. The royal jewels, and even the crown itself, were frequently pawned to secure these loans, a clear sign of the crown's desperate financial situation. Parliament, while generally more supportive of Edward III than of his father, was still reluctant to grant him the extensive taxes he continually demanded for his wars and lavish court. The initial wedding expenses set a precedent for Edward's reign, which, despite its military successes, was almost constantly plagued by financial shortages and mounting debt. The financial strain from this wedding, combined with the escalating costs of the 100 Years' War, meant that Edward III was almost perpetually short of funds. He resorted to unpopular financial measures, including levying heavy taxes on wool exports, which damaged the English economy. The lavishness of his court, while projecting an image of power, was built on a foundation of increasing debt. The wedding, therefore, was not merely a joyous occasion, but a critical early expense that set the English crown on a path of unprecedented borrowing and financial struggle, ultimately contributing to the long-term financial strain that would affect the kingdom for decades. Number 2. Margaret of York and Charles the Bold. The year was 1468, and the setting was Bruges, then the jewel of the Duchy of Burgundy. The marriage of Margaret of York sister of King Edward IV of England to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was one of the most politically significant and undoubtedly the most lavish weddings of the entire medieval period. It was a union designed to forge a powerful alliance between England and Burgundy, a bulwark against France, and a magnificent display of the wealth and power of both houses. The sheer extravagance of the celebrations, however, pushed both the Burgundian and English treasuries to their absolute limits, leaving them deeply in debt. Margaret's journey from England to Sluis in Burgundy was an unparalleled royal procession. A fleet of English ships, commanded by her brother Edward IV, transported her and her colossal retinue across the Channel. The cost of outfitting these ships, provisioning them for the journey, and paying their crews was enormous. Her entourage included 1,000 English nobles, knights, ladies-in-waiting, and servants, all requiring passage and elaborate provisions. Her personal baggage included hundreds of changes of clothes, precious jewels, gold and silver plate, and gifts for the Burgundian court. The spectacle of her arrival in Sluis and her subsequent procession through Bruges was meticulously planned to impress, but every detail came with an exorbitant price tag. The wedding ceremony itself, held on July 3, 1468, in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges, was a dazzling affair. The church was transformed with rich tapestries woven with gold and silver thread, banners depicting the coats of arms of England and Burgundy, and countless candles. Margaret's wedding gown was a masterpiece of luxury, made of cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls and diamonds, and reportedly so heavy that she could barely move. Charles the Bold, equally resplendent, wore robes of crimson velvet adorned with magnificent jewels. The entire Burgundian court and the English delegation were dressed in new custom-made garments of the finest silks, velvets, and brocades, often lined with ermine or sable, all contributing to the astronomical cost. The feasting that followed was legendary in its scale and luxury, lasting for 10 days and nights. Chroniclers like Olivier de la Marche, the master of ceremonies, meticulously documented the banquets. Thousands of guests were served multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Exotic meats like peacock, swan, and even lion were presented, often roasted whole and then redressed in their feathers or skins. Rare and expensive spices, imported from the furthest corners of the world, were used in abundance. Wine flowed from countless barrels, and sugar, a symbol of ultimate luxury, was sculpted into elaborate subtleties, grand architectural edible displays depicting allegorical scenes or mythological figures costing fortunes to design and construct. The sheer volume of provisions and the army of skilled cooks, carvers, and servers required represented an almost unimaginable expenditure. Entertainment was continuous and beyond compare. The celebrations included magnificent jousts and tournaments, renowned for their chivalric display. Knights competed in custom-made gilded armor with horses adorned in richly embroidered caparisons. The lists were specially constructed and elaborately decorated. Prizes of immense value were awarded to the victors. There were elaborate masques, plays, and dances. Musical performances by the finest musicians in Europe, acrobatic displays, and firework shows illuminated the nights. Perhaps most notably, there were elaborate entremets, or theatrical intermissions between courses during the feasts, featuring live actors, mechanical figures, and elaborate sets designed to tell allegorical stories or display the virtues of the ducal house. Each of these spectacles was immensely costly to conceive, construct, and perform. Margaret's dowry was set at the truly colossal sum of 200,000 gold crowns, a figure that placed a massive strain on the English treasury. While Edward IV hoped to gain military and financial aid from Burgundy, the dowry alone was a staggering commitment. Furthermore, Margaret's trousseau, though technically provided by England, was of unparalleled luxury, including entire suites of jewels, gold and silver plate, and furnishings that would outfit a royal palace. Charles the Bold in turn presented Margaret with astonishingly valuable gifts, including the famous rich collar of Flanders, a necklace set with immense diamonds, and a magnificent diamond known as the Burgundian Sancy. The cost of these gifts alone was astronomical. The financial consequences for both England and Burgundy were immediate and crippling. Edward IV, despite his success in restoring the Yorkist dynasty, was perpetually in debt from the Wars of the Roses. The dowry for Margaret, combined with the costs of her journey and the gifts from the English side, represented an immense drain on his treasury. He had to resort to increased taxation, forced loans from merchants, and pawning the crown jewels to raise the necessary funds. This financial strain would contribute to further instability in his reign. For Charles the Bold, the wedding of 1468 was a deliberate display of his power and his ambition to create a powerful new kingdom in Europe. However, the costs of the celebrations, along with his ongoing military campaigns and ambitious projects, plunged the Duchy of Burgundy into an unprecedented level of debt. Chroniclers reported that the ducal treasury was effectively emptied. Charles borrowed heavily from Italian and Flemish bankers, issuing bonds and pledging revenues from his wealthiest cities. The long-term financial burden of this wedding, combined with Charles's subsequent military adventures, would severely weaken Burgundy, ultimately contributing to its decline and his eventual defeat and death in 1477. The marriage of Margaret and Charles, though a spectacular show of power, was a financial disaster for both the English and Burgundian treasuries, leaving a legacy of staggering debt and diminished resources. Number 1. Blanche of Castile and Louis VIII of France. The year was 1200, and the setting was the small village of Port-Mort, on the border between French and Norman territories. The marriage of Blanche of Castile, granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II of England, to Louis, the eldest son and heir of King Philip II, Augustus of France, was an event of immense political significance. It was designed to bring a fragile peace to the long-standing and bitter rivalry between the Plantagenet and Capetian dynasties. However, even in this earlier medieval period, the cost of arranging and celebrating such a high-stakes union, particularly for the royal families involved, credited to the ever-present royal indebtedness. The negotiations for this marriage were protracted and complex, involving detailed discussions about the dowry and territorial concessions. Eleanor of Aquitaine, acting as a formidable diplomat, personally escorted her granddaughter Blanche from Castile through territories that were often hostile or politically uncertain. This journey alone, with a large and noble retinue, required enormous provisioning and security. The expense of transporting Blanche and her considerable trousseau across hundreds of miles of diverse terrain, stopping at numerous fortified towns and castles, represented a substantial outlay for both the Castilian and English, through Eleanor's dowerlands, coffers. Every stop, every formal reception, every gift exchanged along the way, added to the burgeoning bill. The wedding ceremony itself, held on May 23, 1200, was by necessity somewhat muted compared to later centuries, given its sensitive location on the border. However, the presence of the powerful Eleanor of Aquitaine, along with numerous Castilian, English, and French nobles, ensured a dignified and significant event. Blanche, though young, would have been dressed in the finest silks and jewels available, a visible symbol of her royal lineage and the wealth she brought to the union. Louis, as the heir to the French throne, would have worn equally rich attire, reflecting the status of the Capetian dynasty. The formality and solemnity of the occasion belied the vast expenditures already incurred and those yet to come. The feasting that followed, while perhaps not reaching the later extremes of the Burgundian court, was still a substantial undertaking. Medieval royal weddings, even those in less developed logistical environments, involved feeding hundreds if not thousands of people. Records indicate extensive purchases of meat, bread, and wine. Exotic spices, while less common than in later centuries, would still have been present for the most important dishes. Preparations would have stretched the resources of the local estates and required significant transfers of goods and coin from the royal treasuries. The sheer volume of provisions consumed by the assembled noble courts over several days was a major expense. Entertainment would have been more traditional for the early 13th century, focusing on minstrels, troubadours, and perhaps some simple outdoor games or displays of horsemanship. While not as elaborately staged as later tournaments, these still required payments to performers and some level of organization and equipment. The focus, however, was primarily on the political and dynastic importance of the union, rather than overt displays of entertainment. Nevertheless, maintaining the comfort and enjoyment of the assembled nobles and their retinues was a considerable financial undertaking for the French crown, which was hosting the main celebrations. Blanche's dowry was a central element of the marriage agreement, a substantial sum of 30,000 marks, along with the promise of certain territories in Gascony upon the death of Eleanor of Aquitaine. While valuable, this dowry was not liquid cash that could immediately offset the wedding expenses for France. It was a long-term asset. Blanche's trousseau, however, was likely very extensive, brought from Castile, containing precious fabrics, jewels, and household items necessary for her new life as a French princess. Louis, in turn, would have presented her with valuable gifts, including jewels and other symbols of her new status, further adding to the royal expenditure. The financial consequences for the French crown, and indirectly for the English through Eleanor's efforts, were significant. Philip II Augustus, despite his military successes and expansion of royal power, was constantly in need of funds for his ongoing wars with the Plantagenets. The cost of this royal wedding, including the lavish provisions, the reception of the Castilian and English retinues, and the various gifts and ceremonies, added to his existing financial burdens. He, like other monarchs, relied on loans from wealthy merchants and Jewish moneylenders to finance such events. And his military campaigns, the royal treasury was under constant pressure. Furthermore, the arrangement for the dowry and territorial concessions, while politically crucial, had financial implications for both sides. Promise of Gascon territories upon Eleanor's death was a future point of contention, and the dowry itself, though valuable, was a long-term investment rather than an immediate financial relief. Continued maintenance of Louis and Blanche's household as royal heirs also added a permanent expense to the French royal budget, which was already stretched thin by ongoing military ventures and the costs of centralizing royal administration. This early medieval wedding, while less documented in terms of specific financial breakdowns than those of later centuries, still represented a massive expenditure that stressed the financial capabilities of the Capetian monarchy. It was a visible manifestation of royal power and a crucial diplomatic act, but it came at a significant cost that contributed to the ongoing financial struggles of the French crown. The cycle of debt and constant need for funds, common to all medieval monarchs, was certainly exacerbated by the grand and necessary expense of marrying the heir to the throne, ensuring that even this early wedding was a considerable drain on royal resources.